I want, in the name of the Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation, to greet you a warm welcome. We are very glad that this meeting tonight brings such a great audience to us. And I would like to especially thank our Ukrainian friends to come here and sort of share a little bit of their views of what is going on right now in the preparation, in the wake of the elections on the 28th of October. We are nearly having now a little seminar of speeches and meetings on the Ukraine. Some of you might remember that before the summer holidays, we had Arseny Yatsenyuk here, who was telling us about the joining of the opposition in the Ukraine. And it was precisely before he had signed his contract with the mother of Eugenia Tymoshenko. And now I must say it's a great possibility and a very good thing for us that we are having two people who can really speak about what is happening now. We have the daughter of Yulia Tymoshenko, Eugenia, who is traveling all around the world to tell the news about what is happening in the Ukraine. And we also have Dr. Hrihory Nemyria, who is a vice president of the Batkivshchyna party and who was vice premier minister of the Ukraine, and who now also works especially in the international field to get as much support as possible together for the Ukraine, for a real rule of law, for a good, free and fair elections. And it's for us important that in this country of our closest neighborhoods, the elections are going well. So we are not here to sort of clank on and say everything is going wrong, which it obviously in big parts is, but we are also here to become a little bit more constructive and see what can be done for the election and what also can be done for the future of this great country. Because this great country has a big mission. It's one of the cornerstones of the Eastern Partnership. In the beginning of the Eastern Partnership, it was the country which was working best together with Georgia and Moldova. And now it's really falling behind, which is a big worry, especially for us here in Sweden, who together with our Polish friends were the authors of the Eastern Partnership. And on the other hand, the Ukraine is going to be the chairman in office in the OSCE. And the OSCE is an international organization which should work for human rights, democracy, rule of law, and where you automatically wish for that this country is becoming a role model. And as it stands now, Ukraine is at this moment not a role model for the OSCE. And they still have a couple of months' time to change and to show to us that they want to be the role model that we all expect them to become. But I don't think I have to say very much more, because those who are here today know so much more about the whole situation. And I would like to ask perhaps first Eugenia to briefly introduce her ideas and her thoughts, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Walburga, and for inviting us here today. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here to listen to the truth, and really sometimes horrible truth that's going on in Ukraine, behind the repressions, behind the scenes maybe of political rhetoric that goes on in major institutions in the world. But thank you so much for the foundation to invite us here, and for Moderator Party to be here. For me, it's the first time in Sweden, but for my mother, who traveled here so often, being a prime minister, and obviously being in very good relationship with the politicians here, and especially with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Bildt, and many others. And obviously we're thankful to our colleagues in the EPP who organizing such a great support for us around the world, and inviting me and my mother's colleagues especially to talk about political situation. And I'm in this mission, in this process, more as a defender for my mother, a messenger for her, and my role started being present during the trial, during this shameful show trial that lasted for a few months, but really was the example and illustration of the persecutions, the illegality, the absence of rule of law in Ukraine, and the way that the now regime, the politicians now in Ukraine are abusing the law, abusing judiciary system. And the reforms that they're introducing now, so-called reforms, we call it pseudo-reforms, because on the top they're very maybe beneficial, and there are some layers of positivity and reform, but underneath they have very dangerous details, very dangerous changes that bring Ukrainian people under more and more and the more rule and the power of the regime, that taking away their freedoms. And of course, it's not only political prisoners like my mother and Mr. Lutsenko, who is the ex-minister of defense, are suffering now, are humiliated, how their rights are breached every day. They have to defend themselves. It's not only political prisoners who are suffering this fate, but also journalists, because the freedom of speech, the censorship that's been applied to Ukrainian media, which was free just a few years ago, has shown that we are living now in a dictatorship. And as Chancellor Merkel just a few months ago rightly pointed out and diagnosed the political situation in Ukraine, we do live now in a dictatorship. And the new dictator in Ukraine has built a vertical power, and now there's no more divisions to judiciary power, to parliamentary or executive or legislative power. Now there is only one power that is abusing law, that is making people subordinate and fearful to come out on the streets to protest. And if this continues, and this is my mother's greatest concern, if this continues and not stopped before the parliamentary elections this year, which is the first elections that parliamentary elections under Yanukovych, we will see the dictatorship being built on the border of EU. And of course, I wanted to mention my mother's messages, and they are very clear at the moment. Her most concern is not for her freedom, is not for her rights, is not that she's been put on trial almost every day, almost every week. The new absurd accusations rise up against her. We know that Mr. Lutsenko, the ex-minister of Interior, was sentenced for the second time and sent to the northern penal colony just a few weeks ago. And basically, these people are facing term in prison, which we're facing really no hope. We don't know where to turn to inside Ukraine, because inside Ukraine there is no judiciary system that will work to help us. And even now, when united opposition is trying to fight every step of the way and appeal to the courts with the aim to restore, for example, opposition candidates, the main opposition leaders, into the party lists with no success, to restore just bare rights for my mother and for Mr. Lutsenko to use telephone calls. She's one census person in Ukraine who is not allowed telephone conversation. It's another evidence that obviously the regime wants to isolate her and others from the political life, from the even communication with the family, putting a lot of psychological pressure on her. But of course my mother is not broken, and her morale is very strong, and even with small information that passes to her in prison, with the greatest support she feels from around the democratic world, the politicians who come to visit her, just bring her back to life, back to hope, because during her 15-year political career, whether she was in politics, out of politics, in prison, or, in opposition, she always fought for her goal, the goal that would make Ukraine a democratic, transparent country, a great country for its population that would be wealthy and healthy and happy in its own state. And of course, she wanted to pass her her thanks and appreciation for your understanding of the truth behind this repression, of course, to international media who is supporting and showing the whole picture of the processes. To say that new accusations come as a surprise, no, and the dictatorship that Ukraine became and the ruler of the dictatorship accusing my mother and the main opponents in Ukraine without any evidence, without any proof, just shows another time that there is a lot of doubt that the rule of law really exists in Ukraine. And where do we go from here? Of course, my mother's main hope and the colleagues in the opposition, that of course this parliamentary election is going to be the key turning point for the Ukraine politics. And she believes that we cannot wait till the elections are over to evaluate the whole danger of the dictatorship in Ukraine. We have to do it before the elections. We have to name and talk the truth that if the main opposition leaders were not registered as candidates for the election, that means the elections cannot be free and fair already. And of course, with this hope, she lives and she works from prison. Despite she being under video surveillance 24 hours a day, she can write strategy notes to her colleagues and pass them by secret through me. And of course, with every day we feel more and more pressure on her life, on her freedom, and very much worried for her health and her existence, because we're not sure what would be the next step that the regime can take in the fight against its main opponents. And when I met Walburga, it was in Kharkiv, the main meeting that we had, and when I really found out that we have real friends here and we have real friends in democratic world, because they really took the prison by force. They by storm. We stormed into the office of the head of the prison, Colonel Pervushkin, and despite of his very great title, he wasn't even ready or able to, or if he was afraid really, to coordinate the meeting with the representative with Walburga and my mother, and clearly he was breaking the law, but because of his fear, he didn't bulge to our pressure. And the same happens with doctors, the same happens with prosecutors, the same happens with judges in Ukraine, and really the whole population in Ukraine. So here we are asking you with hope to support democracy in Ukraine, democratic freedoms that are left in Ukraine, and of course Ukrainian people who are free-loving people and who want to fight for Ukraine, and just to help them, to let them fight for Ukraine, and we should do it before the elections. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugenia, for your very moving testimony. I mean, I've had the chance of being together with you now for quite some time, but each time I listen to you, I must say it makes me shiver. So I must thank you that I'm very, very grateful that you come and that you give this testimony. And before we take questions or so, I now first ask Dr. Nemyria to talk to us, and then we take questions, the two of them together. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Walburga. Jens, I'd like to thank you, Hjalmarson Foundation and the Moderator Party, and our old friends here in Sweden, the country I visited also in my capacity as a Vice Prime Minister. And one of those visits was, I think, really last in this capacity in November 2009, when we, together with Gunilla Carlsson, the Minister for International Development, launched the Eastern Europe Energy Efficiency and Environmental Protection Initiative, which was one of those projects or initiative that Sweden took within the Eastern Partnership, which quite a promising start. But now time has changed, and I know that friends from the foundation and the Moderator Party always following not just Ukraine but the wider region, and it's always tempting to compare with some neighboring countries. And as a terms of reference was always used countries like Belarus, Russia, Caucasian countries. And my point was always that the difference is that Ukraine aspires to come closer to the European Union and has an ambition to in future become a member. Therefore, the terms of the references should be to compare ourselves with more European standards, to what extent we are compatible. But still, Belarus has a chance, that I want to give you two propositions to think through. One, it always kind of a common point, Ukraine is not Belarus. One of the former presidents of Ukraine wrote a book, Ukraine is not Russia, which is true. There is tempted Ukraine is not Belarus. Why? There is Lukashenko. We know who he is. And we know that there is this dictatorship. And when somebody like Eugenia today is saying call Ukraine dictatorship, or for that matter, Chancellor Merkel back in May in Bundestag, it's always kind of a protest. No, you cannot say this so far. It's not a dictatorship. How you dare to say dictatorship, that there are still elections, that they still don't know actually what would be the results of these elections. But I give you my argument. It's dictatorship in making. For 2.5 years, Yanukovych, and through his policies, produced what Freedom House, among others organizations, called the steepest decline in the institutions of freedom in the world in the year 2011. The steepest decline in the institutions of freedom. It took him 2.5 years. The only elections that happened so far under his presidency were local elections back in October 2010. The modest description of these elections, major step back that Ukraine made from the standards it established itself. These elections, upcoming elections, are going to be the first parliamentary elections under Yanukovych presidency. So my conclusion, before Lukashenko became Lukashenko, who was also became a president in the elections like Yanukovych, mostly free and fair elections. So it took him much more time to become Lukashenko as we all know him. It took much less time for Yanukovych to become Yanukovych. So then the question is, but the country is still different. Ukraine much more heterogeneous. Ukraine, some would argue, especially those who are interested in the history, had a stronger sense of the national identity, while still with regional cleavages, but still kind of sense of citizenship that's not necessarily as strong as it is in Ukraine, in Belarus, for example. True. We do have a success story that, for that matter, Belarus or Russia are lacking, Orange Revolution, because that, for the first time in the history of modern Ukraine, as one of those histories of the modern post-Soviet states, that people revolted against the major, large-scale electoral fraud and managed to succeed. It's not such a success story that Belarusians or Russians, Russian people could claim they have. So in a sense, that was a defining moment for Ukraine and for its trajectory to the future that some neighboring countries are lacking. Still, with that, one could argue that there are more differences. While Belarus, whatever called it, transformation or lack of transformation, it's closed society to a large extent. It's either enormously relied to the support from Russia and very little exposed to outside world. While Ukraine, 52% of Ukrainians' GDP comes from our exports. So we're very much dependent on the state of the health from outside world. It has to do some implications, not just in terms of the economic state of affair, but also for the thinking over the potential effectiveness of using the instruments that were used and are used now in Belarusian case, namely sanctions or restrictive measures against Lukashenko, his family, and representatives of the regime, which have mixed records, to put it mildly. So some people think that precisely because Ukraine is much more open, much more exposed, and those interests, economic interests, naked self-interest of people around Yanukovych, including his family, which is a new phenomenon, so exposed that those neuralgic points, if properly used in timely and again calibrated manner, may produce some results. And I'm raising these questions intentionally, because what we have now, this deterioration in democratic standards, didn't happen overnight. It took, as I said, 2.5 years. So, and as long as it's developed in this wrong direction, many traditional diplomatic instruments have been used already. We had a very strong statements, clear statements from various institutions, ranging from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, European Parliament. In July, Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE adopted special resolution on Ukraine. There is no lack on resolutions. Finally, language political prisoners, now widely used, not just the representatives of the political family that our party belonged to. In the most recent resolution, for example, of the Socialist International in Cape Town in South Africa, they have 2 paragraphs on the chapter titled Europe, Belarus and then Ukraine. They're almost identical. You could substitute Statkevich name with Tymoshenko name, and you could substitute Belarus with the Ukraine name, and you could read, and it's impression that it's about Ukraine. So all those instruments are needed, and signs of the support are very important. And those who, like Walburga and other friends, are trying to bypass the rigidity of the Ukraine's penitentiary system, Ministry of Health, Procurator's Office, Prosecutor's Office, and to try and to see, they put in this pressure, which is a legitimate pressure and highly welcome. But the question is, if these instruments are not effective enough, and the situation is not improving, but deteriorating, what other instruments? And here the crossroad. One approach is, look, we have in 2 months elections. Let's wait and see what would happen after elections. We want Yanukovych. He said, read my lips, I guarantee these elections are going to be free and fair. And we are watching. So, but then the results will come, then there will be a judgment, and then depending on that, 1, second, depending on the fate of the political prisoners, and 3, whether the real reforms to bring independent judiciary will start or not, will consider other options that so far are not considered in a comprehensive manner. There are growing appetite for that, but not yet. So there is one approach to that. Quite legitimate, quite traditional one. Because elections, in all, one of the markers whether the democratic system is functioning or not functioning. But this is precisely the growing point of concern that Yulia is making. And as Eugenia said, me and my colleagues, we have a chance to kind of exchange some notes with that, because she's not allowed to phone. The last time I saw her was on the eve of her detention and arrest in the 5th of October of last year. So her concern that with the first approach, you are running the risk to basically involuntarily, indirectly legitimize the regime, which is dictatorship in making. Why? Because what Yanukovych apparently tried to achieve, a mixture of the following 3 things. 1, to keep his major existential political opponents, Yulia and others, in prison forever. He has already disqualified them as a political actors, as they are not participating in the elections. So he is half way to achieving this goal. Second, He wants elections to be broadly recognized as generally within the Council of Europe OSCE standards, of course with some violations, of course a lot of irregularities, but who is perfect? We're a young democracy, we're trying to aspire to a larger standards. We're just 21 years old as an independent country. And third part of this fruit he wants to take is, in a way, international legitimization of his regime through giving a green light for the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union to go forward. This is kind of the expectations plan. So for that, he is going to try to negotiate potentially some flexibility on the first issue as far as the humanitarian conditions of keeping his political opponents in prison. Okay, you're not happy with your phones, we consider. That Yulia doesn't have a phone, we consider. You're claiming that's this or that, okay, maybe. So you may have more visitors. You see, I'm not a tyrant. I'm not cannibal. I'm not willing to kill them. But this is the case. So that's what I think we understand as the Yanukovych's positioning in the year 2012, 2 months ahead before the elections. But that also speaks for, gives additional arguments for what measures should be taken to prevent this course of the event, wait and see to happen. Because he also counts on many distractions. Not that the Eurozone crisis, not that there are many elections in Georgia, in Belarus, and many other countries, including the EU member countries that are taking place, and that would distract the opinion. He also counts that Ukraine is not Belarus in a different sense. Ukraine is an instrumental in being a partner for the EU to solve, for example, the Transnistrian conflict on 5+2, which Ukraine is a member of. Ukraine is going to be chairman of the OSCE next year. And while it was possible to cancel, which is a major, unfortunately, diplomatic fiasco for my country, that for the first time in the history, the summit that Ukraine was going to chair in its capacity as chairman of the CEI, Central European Initiative, was cancelled. Why? Because a number of the presidents, President of Germany, President of Austria, and heads of the states of other states refused to go. Some of them clearly saying the reason why, because of the political repressions in Ukraine. So he still counts on these developments that would make instruments other than those used before kind of prevent of using them. There is some perceptual mistake which also I want to dwell on. There's sometimes an inclination to consider, especially in the media, but sometimes even in the research analytic community, that's who is Yanukovych? He's pro-Russian or he's pro-European? He has enough wealthy interest behind him that would be rather against going under the Russia, oligarchs controlled by the Kremlin, and rather would prefer to have a more freedom to compete in the Western markets. Russian, pro-Russian or pro-European. His voters are from mostly Eastern Ukraine, which I'm from, and Yulia Tymoshenko is from. She's from Dnipropetrovsk, I'm from Donetsk. So that's why it's a wrong dilemma. He's neither nor. His interest is neither to go to the European Union in a real sense, nor to find himself under the Russian dominance. Because Ukrainian oligarchs has no chance to compete, and those who enjoy the protectorate from Yanukovych, no chance to compete from the oligarchs supported by Kremlin. And he knows very well, since the time he was a governor of Donetsk Oblast, how few, if any at all, investments from the Russian Federation were materialized in eastern Ukraine, precisely because of the lack of interest of the local oligarchs to compete with the Russian oligarchs. So, but then who is Yanukovych? Where his interest? His interest that Ukraine stay where it is now, namely in a gray zone in between. Russia, with all changes or lack of, depending the angle you look at it, and the European Union. Gray zone in a sense of security, gray zone in a sense of the foreign policy clear preferences, but also, I would convey to you, gray zone in sense of the economic integration priorities. But then question why he looks like people around him still interested in a deep and comprehensive free trade. Not to the extent that you could think of, because if they are, then the leverage used so far, I think the strongest. Mr. Yanukovych, we completed negotiations on DCFTA. Here is it on the table. We initialed it, but for it to go forward, signatures and then further ratification, those are conditions, what we expect you to deliver. That was a trap theory that was widely supported within the EU, but it didn't work. Because for Yanukovych, the future of the DCFTA is not as strong leverage as it was in the minds of some policymakers within the European Union. And I give you some also at the end, and it will be open for your questions. Most recently, the World Economic Forum published the Global Competitiveness Report of 2012-2013. Ukraine found itself a little bit progress, but namely because of the number of countries where statistics was not available, and place seat number 73. And while the EU member countries, I think within the first 10, there are 5 EU member countries, including, of course, Sweden. But I give you, and there are a number of dimensions within it. I'll give you 3 or 4. Transparency of government policy making. Transparency of government policy making. Sweden is number 8. And the only other EU country who is in the first 10 is Finland. The others are New Zealand and others. Where is Ukraine? It's 123. Next to Russian Federation, El Salvador, Guinea, Ethiopia, Bolivia, Mauritania, and others. Judicial independence. Sweden is number 8, number 9. Ukraine is 124, between Algeria and Peru and Burkina Faso and Cameroon. Diversion of funds. Diversion of public funds to companies, individuals, or groups due to the corruption. So Sweden number 6, together with Denmark, New Zealand, Finland. While Ukraine is 117, again, together with Burkina Faso, Senegal, also Greece here was put here. Irregular payment and bribes on corruption, 133 Ukraine, with Uganda, Venezuela, Benin, Kyrgyz Republic, Yemen, Mali, Burundi, Chad, whatever. Effectiveness of anti-monopoly policy, even on the quality of the roads, where Sweden is not in the first 10, but number 25 for some reason. Ukraine found itself even behind Russia. Those who speak Russian, they know maxim that there are 2 problems in Russia, duraki и дороги, so fools and roads. So there is, Ukraine's roads looks like almost if not the same, but so it's easier to solve problem, it looks like easier to solve problem with dorogi than with duraki, but I think it's different. Unless you solve problem with duraki, you never solve the problem with dorogi. But in Ukrainian sense, it's not fools. It's something which close to authoritarian decision makers. And the most sensitive part of my presentation, I don't want to take more time. The question frequently asked, but look, precisely because of the things you mentioned. You had a success story. People has a confidence that other citizens in other countries may not have. If, again, larger electoral fraud and sense that it is huge injustice and major falsifications are going on, and if people would go again on the streets, do you expect the second Orange Revolution? And tempting to say yes, no. No, the Orange Revolution, it was the Orange Revolution, a very unique event which never ever would take the place. But there are things to take into account. Not necessarily people go to the streets en masse just because of the political corruption. There are much higher chance that they rather sooner than later will go to the streets because of the growing social problems, because economy in a very, very extremely difficult circumstances. With the lack of external finance, there is no IMF money on the horizon. So for 2 years after the resumption of resuming the IMF program, standby program, Ukraine is not getting this money precisely because of this absence of reforms. There is no money that are coming that Yanukovych expected from milking to other cow, Russian Federation, while they're waiting for the low-hanging fruit just to take, if needed, for some strategic assets to get control on. Hopes now with China, which is kind of a traditional hopes in this part of the region, which is not going to materialize sometime soon. So there is a strong element of the social reason why people will go to the streets, not necessarily in the major cities or capital cities or the megapolises in the east or in the center. They would rather go to the small and medium-sized towns like miners' town, steelworkers' town, which has a very huge mobilizational potential. And then, you know, the whole history of the last year, 2.5, showed a very critical change of behavior, or if you put academically, civil-military relationships. While Orange Revolution was distinct that it was peaceful and neither police nor army was involved, so this time the way how the troops are instructed behave in the course of the peaceful assemblies and peaceful manifestations are really worrying. There is really worrying statistics, and yesterday the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Torbjörn Jagland, who was in Kiev, mentioned, among others, this factor, but also a very personal factor. I would like to remind you that it was Viktor Yanukovych in 2004, Prime Minister running for the presidency, who called and insisted and was very strong in his arguments, trying to convince President Kuchma, outgoing President Kuchma, to call army, interior ministry forces, and police on Maidan. He never ever accepted that there were major electoral fraud. He still believes that he was deprived victory in 2004 and nothing wrong has happened. His political culture, upbringing, the whole habits of making political career makes him very prone and vulnerable to the arguments of using force. Ukraine so far is one of the few rare post-Soviet states that escaped violence, either ethnic-based violence, despite of the fact that we have more than 300 Tatars in the Crimea who are coming back and lacking any property rights, and their settlements were under constant attack, despite of the fact that we have a proximity, in our immediate proximity, frozen conflicts like Transnistria in Moldova, and among other factors. So this time it might be very different. So the question to ask, and I'm coming back to my two strategies to approach, whether it would be more responsible to think through now already of what needs to be done to prevent this worst case scenario, the probability for this scenario to fulfill. And we believe that's precisely because of this exposure, because of the various dependencies that Yanukovych and the phenomena of the family has now accumulated, that might be some preventive measures, in a sense, using instruments that were not used so far to warn him. We are watching not enough. in addition to we are watching you, that should be a very important argument. I consciously missed the points that Walburga suggested me to develop further, the stance of the opposition. And Mr. Yatsenyuk mentioned that the opposition united. I will be open to answer this question if it will come. But now, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, both of you. I must say it was extremely interesting to share your views with you. And I must say I'm glad and grateful that you did not only say, as I had asked you before, only the negative things, that you also gave scenarios and said to us what we can do. I want to wish you all the best on your mission over the next 7 weeks, for the election campaign and for everything you are going to do to make us here in the West aware of what is happening. And I ask you, Eugenia, to please tell your mother all our best wishes, and she must know that she has very good friends here in Sweden. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And from us, a small token of this is little heart
Thank you very
from
much.
the party, but also from our heart to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.